So good afternoon, good evening, happy Friday to everyone. I would like to welcome everyone to Asianism Retold. Asianism Retold is an initiative to understand the nature of Asian values and identity and the role of these values in the region's development in global geopolitics and in shaping the next set of international concepts. The program was founded by Ms. Neha Bansal, one Asia Fellow at Harvard University's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, and receives high-level technical partnership from the Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement, represented by my colleague here, Dr. Pramad Jaswal, and myself, a former fellow from Harvard University and vice president at the Center for Asia Leadership. So I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. Ms. Neha Bansal, along with being appointed the prestigious Asia Fellowship by Harvard University's Ash Center for Democratic Governance, Neha is a senior social policy expert, and she has served as India country head for the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery and the United Nations in various roles. She is also an Indian classical dancer. Ambassador Shyam Saran is a former Foreign Secretary of India and has served as the Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Nuclear Affairs and Climate Change. He has been ambassador to several countries, including Myanmar, Nepal, and Indonesia. Ambassador Saran is currently a senior fellow with the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. Welcome, sir. Mr. Gowher Rizvi is a Bangladeshi historian, scholar, and academic. Currently, he is the International Affairs Advisor to the Prime Minister of Bangladesh. Prior to that, he was MacArthur Fellow in International Relations at Nuffield College in Oxford University. He was also an editor of Contemporary South Asia and a fellow of the Royal Historical Society. He held various appointments at Oxford University, the University of Warwick, the University of Canterbury, Harvard Kennedy School, and the University of Virginia. Welcome, Mr. Gowher. Professor Yong Lee, joining us from South Korea, is professor in the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Korea University. His research examines how identities and norms affect and are affected by states and their practices within domestic and international contexts, with a focus on the international political economy. With respect to Asian values, Professor Lee has recently published an article in the Review of International Studies, which is entitled Performing Civilizational Narratives in East Asia, Asian Values, Multiple Modernities, and the Politics of Economic Development. Professor Lee is the author and editor and translator of 7 books. We also have T.M. Krishna. He is an artist, a Carnatic vocalist, an author, and he is one of the preeminent vocalists in the rigorous Carnatic tradition of India's classical music. I don't know much about this, but I'd like to hear more. Also, being a public intellectual, Krishna speaks and writes about issues affecting the human condition and about matters cultural. His book, Reshaping Art, published by Aleph Books Company in 2018, asks important questions about how art is made, performed, and disseminated, and addresses crucial issues of caste, class, and gender within society while exploring the contours of democracy, culture, and learning. Finally, we have Dr. Nicole CuUnjieng Aboitiz, who from the Philippines, who is a fellow at Clare Hall, supervisor in world history, and the executive director of the Toynbee Prize Foundation. She was previously a postdoctoral fellow at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. And she also earned her Ph.D. in Southeast Asian and International History at Yale University. Her first book, Asian Place, Filipino Nation, A Global Intellectual History of the Philippine Revolution, was published by Columbia University Press in June 2020. And charts the emplotment of place in the proto-national thought and revolutionary organizing of turn of the 20th century Filipino thinkers. So welcome to all of our speakers. It's a real pleasure and honor to have all distinguished academics and practitioners here in this forum here at Asianism Retold. Before I pass the floor to my colleague Neha, I'll just go over some housekeeping rules and some reminders. So we are definitely eager and honored to hear from each of our distinguished speakers. We do ask that you keep your remarks at 10 to 12 minutes only. Followed by that, we will have a discussion between the panelists and thereafter with the audience. We also request those in the audience to send us your questions, which I myself will monitor. And if the question is or comment is for a particular panelist or if it's for all of them. And we will do our very best to accommodate each of the questions as best as we can. With those remarks, I would like to now pass the floor to my colleague Neha. So Neha, the floor is yours.
Welcome once again to each of our esteemed speakers. We are so excited to have each of you here. Thank you once again for giving us and this very important topic your time. As John said, thank you also for all those who are joining in the virtual audience. As with every forum, this forum also has its limits, but we want to stress the fact that this is really a dialogue and an engagement, and we want you to be part of that. So as much as we can, we will accommodate your comments, questions, perspectives, and that's the very idea of this roundtable. Now, Asianism Retold. This very effort of ours to understand and debate the Asian values, the Asian sensibility. We started this about a year ago, and we've had so far 3 formal roundtables. This is the third of 2 other roundtables. And we also had 2 other informal conversations, so about 5 dialogue series. And these have been with senior diplomats. We've had the former permanent secretary from the Foreign Ministry of Singapore. We've had development experts, scholars, Parag Khanna, the author of The Future is Asian, scholars from the Asia Pacific University in Japan, from Hong Kong, the human rights expert who works with the UN Human Rights Rapporteur, people from villages, people from big towns, people from the private sector, from the development sector. But very, very importantly, one section of people that we have really made a lot of effort to have at the table are artists. And essentially because we feel that in the future on development, we have, I think, paid the price of not having their perspective and vision, and we can no longer afford that. And so we have had artists at all our previous roundtables, and so also this one we have Mr. T. and Krishna, who I'm very excited to hear from. Now, in these series of conversations that we've had over this last 1 year, 5 key Asian values or sensibilities were expressed to us. The first, informality, informal structures. The second was family. The third being a very dominant presence of religion. The fourth was an equally dominant presence of the state, of a central authority. And the fifth one is something that I'm still trying to articulate, but it was about paradoxes. The fact that we have a sensibility towards paradoxes. So just as much as faith is important to us, doubt is equally important. And, or for example, languages can say 2 things at the same time. Now, whether that's a past or a current value is something for us to assess. But these were the 5 key values that have been expressed to us by these different sections of people. The objective of today's roundtable is to discuss these values, these 5 values, accept them, negate them, suggest different ones, but really to thrash out the Asian sensibility and also to thrash out whether it exists or whether it doesn't exist, whether it should exist. The second is to understand how will these values play a role in the kind of cities we are developing, in the kind of health systems we are planning, in the kind of migration policies we are drafting, essentially, or foreign policy, essentially in the kind of world that we want to craft around us as we go forward. Now, I'll go a little more specifically into why we started Asianism Retold and what is Asianism Retold in this background of looking at Asian values. So as John said, I had spent most of my career with the UN and with several other international development bodies. And these were roles across Asia dealing with people's lives, dealing with countries' development. And as we went along, we would often use terms like vulnerable, underdeveloped, not advanced. And it continues and it constantly left me with a discomfort. What are the yardsticks against which we assess these parameters of not developed, needs to be developed, vulnerable, etc. Well, of course, if you ask anybody or you ask myself, the yardsticks are a global idea of modernity. And that global idea of modernity itself contains several values. So it could be things like, a great emphasis on individualism and therefore expression, a representative form of government, open capitalist economies, formal structures, whether it's in institutions, in hospital, in healthcare, education, and so on. And I think this is a scenario that is common to several of us in the development sector. Now, I'll go a little more specific into an area of work that I was working on, which was child labor. And what I saw were the ramifications of this. So child labor, an area that is a global problem faced by different countries. And we came down very heavily with a moral lens on child labor, as a result of which, and more so in certain countries, as a result of which, what happened was a certain sensationalization of of child labor, but also maybe an extraordinary focus on the scale of the problem in terms of the number of children in child labor and so on. Then what we did was we said, okay, one solution or one approach to this global issue is education. Education, education, education. And we went, if I may say so, in the line of our nose. And we wanted all children to be in school. So now, has this global experiment on education worked? The answer to that is no. What we are seeing is that perhaps in the last 50 years, as a result of the efforts that we've made in education, going with this one global solution that we thought of putting children in school, of promoting education, would be that there would be greater per capita income, countries would become richer. So in the last 50 years, we've moved the number of years that children spend in education from 2.8, for instance, approximately 3 years, to 8.3 years. Countries which had individuals at 2.3 years in the 1960s earned a certain countries which had about 8.3 years of education for their individuals were about 5.5 times richer than countries that had their children for only about 3 years. Today, 50 years later, that scenario hasn't changed much. It's only about a difference of about 1.6%. even countries which have remained, let's say, 5 years of education for their children, say France, and you compare that with another country, per capita income hasn't grown in that measure. And even if it has grown, there are several other factors that you can point out to that. Has that education resulted in greater mobility? The answer to that is no, not to the extent that we thought or had hoped from this solution. So, in the words of several economists, Ricardo Hausman, Lance Pritchett, the verdict is that this experiment is increasingly disappointing. But what we did was, what we are doing and what we did was, we said, okay, let's ban child labor, which happened in 1986, to give you an example from India. But the right to education, even though we focused on that as an important solution, came 30 years later. So in our attempt to get the house in order, we spent 30 years and therefore 2 generations of people, owing to the fact which resulted in many more people, many more children joining some of the worst forms of child labor. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that one is that we went very heavily after what we thought was a globally accepted solution to a global problem, education. We tried very hard to put our house in order, and in that, going very blindly with that, we banned child labor first, and then came with the right to education 30 years later. Today, we are, as a lot of you from the development sector will know, we are sitting on a learning crisis, where we've created individuals who are now dependent on degrees, concepts, systems, processes. Less number of people who are able to creatively shift from responding to one solution to the other. We have organizations like Tesla, Google, the World Economic Forum that are saying, let's have more people outside of institutions. Let's have them learn on the job. Yet, government continues to spend. We also continue to spend not just on education, but on skilling, reskilling, and then fixing the mismatch between what we've taught in school and what the job sector needs. Now, we know this. The point that I want to highlight is that while we went in the direction of what we thought was one global solution, and I don't think that the fault lies really there, I think we missed one very dangerous step, or what is turning out to be dangerous, which is to look at what were the systems available to us around us. And one very important system that we have is informal systems, or our informal systems. Interpersonal relations, interpersonal systems based on interpersonal interactions, informality, a value that I also mentioned was expressed to us at the different roundtables. Where these informal systems have been put in, they have had immeasurable results on reducing or curbing child labor. And I think the answer for that is that women get into the labor market. They're able to access the informal sector better. When a woman is in the labor market, she is able to spend on her children. Also, as per a very interesting report by the World Bank that came out last year, they said that those informal markets, those hubs at the border, were actually contributing to informal interaction between India, Bangladesh. We have Dr. Gowher, Rizvi here, that have not just, again, increased people's income, but again contributed to curbing things like child labor and trafficking and so on. Now, one can assume that when I take the example of informal systems as one area, that comes out as a Asian value and also something that can be looked at from our development frameworks, is that this was perhaps history. This is something traditional. So we had somebody at one of our roundtables, a very senior professor from the Korea Public Policy Institution. And she has done phenomenal work on mapping values of people in current times. And she has an entire data set and an algorithm that does that. And one of the values, again, that was expressed was the preference for informal relationships, informal systems. And um, uh, I would say that this is something that we're seeing also in industry. So Harvard Business Review did an entire edition last year saying that companies are now resorting back to that. So we had a previous system called the Kiritsu or the Zaibitsus that were abolished because they were considered to be very primitive, passé. You needed a more contract-based system, and now companies are coming back and saying that system is not working anymore. We need systems that support values that are reflective of people today, and one of which is informal systems. So I think the reason why I take this example, a deep dive into this example, is not because I'm an advocate for children in labor or out of school or for a particular system like informal systems. I think the case that I want to make is that as we're looking at global problems, as we're looking at developing ourselves, we've got to look very keenly at some of the systems or that are around us based on what people prefer in terms of their value systems. We've also got to look at the fact that modernization hasn't been a homogenizing process. We don't modernize in the same way. Each kind of country, each region will find its own path to modernize, to develop, and till we don't legitimize that, till we don't start talking about that, till we don't identify that, we will continue to spend our time putting our house in order and following perhaps solutions that are extremely expensive, both in terms of resources, time, and also in terms of the consequences that they have on people. So it is with that discussion that we started this whole program called Asianism Retold, which started in the cafe at Harvard University. It was really a back of the envelope kind of conversation. But what we found was that several people equally dissatisfied with the binary focus on development, needing to understand the different routes. And the fact that there are also in today's current times scholars who have already begun work on this under the name of multiple modernities. I was introduced to Professor Tu Wing Ming, his work, and S.N. Eisenstadt from Israel, both who've done incredible work in this whole area of saying that we've got to look at individual paths or unique paths that countries, regions take to modernizing and developing. So with that, we started these roundtable series. And essentially the reason for the roundtables and these discussions was that, like I said, the biggest gap in moving ahead with this work was that there weren't enough conversations happening on this subject. And we as Asians ourselves hadn't legitimized who we were. Even as I talk, I think when I talk about informal systems, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who are going to say, who perhaps feel that, look, I mean, come on, that's still very primitive. And why are we going back to something so passe? We've moved on from that. So you will have factions of people like that. And you will have factions of people who, including myself, who haven't really understood who we are and how do we therefore bring ourselves and who we represent to bear in our development policies. So it's with that we started the Roundtable series, and I'm happy and I think encouraged by the fact that today in 1 year we have about more than 200 people who have joined this conversation. The second is that we also have, we will be coming out with a book next year of essays on people who are writing about these subjects, and a workshop hosted from Japan. And thirdly, we will also be starting an advisory section under Asianism Retold to advise governments of the region on some of these issues. And we're already working towards a project with Vietnam that will start sometime next year. So that's really a background, a very brief background on the I would say the kind of frustration, the discomfort, and what led me and my partners to start Asianism Retold. Very quickly, before I leave the floor, I just want to tell you what Asianism is not, because I think that is going to be very important in the conversation that we have this afternoon. The first is that we need to define ourselves, we need to understand our values, no longer in relation to the West. This topic on Asianism isn't new. There have been several who've spoken before this. And the tendency has been to kind of look at cultural relativism and to compare us or differentiate us in context to the West. I don't think we can do that anymore. We are at a time where we are sitting at a certain cultural confidence, a certain success in the Asian region, and also for the fact that COVID is presenting us with an opportunity to recalibrate and look at issues afresh. Second, even when we do look at a set of values, we cannot look at Pan-Asianism. They are going to percolate and penetrate Asia very differently. Even if we look at informal systems, it will find its shades and flavors across Asia, and we've got to find a way to understand that as well. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I think we'd prefer to hear from our speakers, our esteemed speakers. I'd be happy to take any comments and questions later on. But I'd like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Gowher Rizvi, to join us and give us your views on this entire question on Asian values, Asian sensibilities. You represent a country, Bangladesh, which is really a fascinating growth story, a success story in the South Asian region. What is the scope for these kind of conversations in your country? And as I said, give us your idea of the Asian sensibility. Over to you, Dr. Gowher Rizvi. I think you may have to
unmute yourself.
My apologies.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Thank you, Neha. Thank you very, very much, first, for giving me an opportunity to join this as a wonderful discussion. And also thank you for your splendid introduction. That has at least helped me to clarify my mind. And there is another very special reason why I am so happy this morning. I see my friend and guru, two of my friends and gurus in the audience, Shyam Saran and Professor S.D. Mooney. I have learned a lot at their feet, and it's always such a pleasure and an experience listening to them. And also I want to greet another friend of mine who I had not seen for a long time, but from the list I see, she is there, Meenakshi Gopinath, my favorite person. So with those couple of comments, I'm really happy to be here. I think my starting point is that what goes round mostly as the Asian values were drawn mostly from East Asia and Southeast Asian experiences. Not that there is anything wrong with it. They're extremely, extremely insightful. But the fact is, Asia is much too large to be lumped together. And you made that point also, into one entity. There are a great deal of diversities in Asia. And secondly, those of us who come from South Asia, so my perspective will invariably be from South Asia, and I will talk more specifically, if time permits, about Bangladesh. Our disadvantage has been that despite our great aspirations for an Asian world, Asian vision of society, and Asian values, South Asia and Southeast and East Asia has had very limited interaction. You know, as a student of history, I go back to the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, when Japan defeated Russia in the war, and the whole of Asia, South Asia, was excited that for the first time after several hundred years, an Asian power had defeated a Western or European power. Thereafter, this enthusiasm, unfortunately, even Tagore, who was very, very excited, but this excitement soon paled out when we experienced the sort of nationalism in Japan, and our excitement, our experience of Netaji Subhash Bose's experience, where he was treated very, very unfairly, in many cases, left to fend for himself when the Japanese changed their mind. So that, coupled with our experience of imperial rule, because what imperialism does is integrates the economy, the society of the colonies into that of the metropolis. Once that happened, despite our proximity to the rest of Asia, we were very much focused on the West. Even until recently, we had scarcely any connectivity with Southeast Asia and Asia. Even today, it is extremely difficult to fly directly from many of the South Asian places to many of the East Asian and Southeast Asian countries, despite the proximity. Secondly, our students, today we have world-class universities in India, Singapore, China, Japan, Thailand, elsewhere. However, our students mostly choose to go to the West. So with all these, I could go on endlessly about why we are so, despite our proximity, Southeast and East Asian experience has very limited. Second point I would like to make is what has often been identified, and you have listed that in your own introduction as well as the note you sent us. Are these really Asian values, or some of them are the global values? Many of them are really a global values, and these are not characteristic of any particular society. We all work hard, just not the East Asians work. We all have family values. We all respect our, so these are, what I'm trying to say is, there are two simultaneous problems. One is trying to apply the experience of one region to the rest of Asia or the world, or alternatively, claiming all the global values for one region. These are two very important things that we need to bear in mind as we talk about the Asian values. South Asia, we are a civilizational unity. South Asia. There may be many countries, but we are essentially one civilization, a shared history, a shared past, a shared outlook for today, and also shared outlook for the future. There are certain values. Despite all difficulties, we have placed a lot of emphasis. We have placed a lot of emphasis on democratic values. Now, of course, democratic values are also important in East Asia and Southeast, but there is a very important distinction. We may be chaotic, we may be noisy, we may go through a little turbulence here and there, but the fact is our democracy doesn't accept authoritarianism. We are essentially, our democracy may be weak, may be fledgling, but we do not accept authoritarian regimes, authoritarian democracy, if one can use that contradictory term. We are very, very much. In other words, we are also very much attached to our freedom of expression. That's why I said we are noisy, but we do not suppress those feelings and individuality, which makes it sometimes difficult for governments, sometimes difficult for progress. But on the whole, what it has provided us is a continuity, as indeed through the East Asians have also had a long history of continuity, which has enabled them to get to where they are. Now, for speaking strictly from a Bangladeshi point of view, for us, the most important values, as with elsewhere, is our commitment to liberalism. But by liberalism, we have a very, very clear definition. It's not only liberal democratic values and institutions, however imperfect, but that is a very important value for us. But liberalism also brings for us pluralism. We are a very plural society, all of us, despite in Bangladesh with 99% of the population Bengali speaking, we are a very diverse society, and therefore plurality is absolutely central to our outlook. And with plurality comes secularism. Religion is an important part of one's personal life in South Asia, and especially in Bangladesh. But in Bangladesh, secularism goes way beyond religious tolerance. Of course, tolerance is there, but it is integrated into every facet of our life. And this comes from our history. Bangladesh, although it is an Islamic Muslim majority state, but what most people forget, that essentially the people, whether Hindus or Muslim, they're essentially the same. Christians, Hindus, Buddhists are all same. And the reason that sameness even today exists is because Islam came to South Asia, especially Bengal, through Sufis. And the result of that is we have a very strong syncretic traditions. So we not only have, we are separate religious groups, but we have borrowed so closely from each other, which has what has given vitality to Bangladesh. And these are, which we had not paid enough attention to, is what is contributing to Bangladesh's rapid success. A national consensus born out of our war of liberation, which emphasizes these values and which makes it possible for us to have a national goal, which is very, very difficult to achieve in many societies and in many countries. I'll make two more points and then I will really stop. The first thing is, we have placed intense value. You talked about education, and that is absolutely essential in every society. When Bangladesh became independent, our literacy was hovering in the region of 20%. Today, in 50 years, we have crossed 80% mark. So we have placed the quality of education, or what education is, or what is an appropriate education, is an ongoing debate which will continue. But most important emphasis we have placed is on our women. And Bangladesh has, I think, a lesson what many countries can learn. It was a country which had the highest fertility rate in the whole of South Asia, by miles. And we were told that it is a conservative society, Muslim society. These chaps will never know how to bring things under control. With the empowerment of women, with giving women a greater control over their reproductive rights, making them economically empowered, they have not only helped to bring our fertility rate down, and it is the lowest in South Asia today, but also they are bringing up next generation of educated children. Extraordinary thing that has happened. Second, a point about our, I think, which is very important to bear in mind. We were not focused on per capita income. Per capita income, we took it as one of the many indicators of growth and development, but not the most important or the only criteria. Instead, we focused on broad-based social development in every way, so that the population as a whole can come up together. And we invested in areas which no developing country could even imagine. We tried to create a basic, means-tested, of course, basic social safety network. So nobody is going to starve or die of deprivation. We created basic health, but universal free medical health care for everybody. But basic, I'm not saying we have a high quality of medical, but these two things has enabled us to achieve life expectancy, which is now touching compared to many of the developed countries, and in some cases exceeding. And despite the fact that all these measures that we were taking were against the so-called Washington Consensus, the so-called World Bank prescriptions, defying them and investing money at the grassroots, creating job opportunities, guaranteeing a certain period of employment, has meant that our per capita income has now also grown. It has grown very, very rapidly, partly because of this, partly because of our investment in infrastructures, road transport, and so forth. Combination of these two things has really enabled us. And I think today, although the downside is our rapid growth has also come at the expense of enhanced inequality. And this is a danger. We saw this danger in Korea, and I sometimes fear that we are ignoring it. Because once this increases, all the things that I've been talking about. So I just wanted to share a few thoughts about Bangladesh. Our values are not different, but they are much more specifically focused based on our history, culture, and the experience of our liberation war. And so I look forward to hearing from others. And I will in advance beg excuse from you all. I have another commitment, so I'll stay as long as I can, but then I'll have to rush away because because adjusting time between South Asia and where I am, I'm in Europe at the moment, it has been very, very difficult. So I have to go to a meeting. Thank you so much, and greetings to all my friends who are there. Thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you, Dr. Rizvi. I mean, you've pointed out several very interesting factors as we start this afternoon. First of all, thank you for joining us from Europe. And I had a conversation with your office, and I almost negotiated very hard. I think your team will tell you to say that, please, can we have you for 1 hour? So I hope they will let you stay for 1 hour. But I think you bring some very important points to the table. The first of which, and I hope we can trash this out today, is that of course, a lot of the values that we have are not going to be Asian alone. They are, Asians have traveled across the world. We have also travelers and people who come and settle into Asia. Asians are leading international institutions and our kind of education. So obviously, our values are going to be a mix between what is held in other parts of the world, but there will still be a sensibility that is peculiar to the region. Now, the task at hand is to try and understand that combination, to understand that entirety. And you're also very right in saying that the interaction between South Asia and South Asia has been very limited. In fact, when we started this project, it was several argue that we should let this be a South Asian project alone. And we had to negotiate very hard to say that no, we will fall into the same problem of silos. It's got to be a pan-Asian program, no matter how ambitious. We've got to look at it for Asia completely. But I also want to return to some of the key things, and I'll put them in two baskets that you said, and we'll probably come back. One is, I think, from what I understood of what you said, placing too much emphasis on democracy. And we'll come back to that. And the second is, um, you pointed out maybe 3 or 4 areas why Bangladesh has made the progress that it has. One is commitment to secularism, liberalism, pluralism, the emphasis on women, the priority given to women's empowerment, the non-priority to per capita, and looking at what are some of the grassroots aspects that your population needs. I think what would be interesting is to come back to understand how did Bangladesh do it, as you said, in defiance to some of the international frameworks and organizations. What was that unique route that Bangladesh took to actually achieving that? We'll of course come back to that, and we'll look forward to hearing from you on that. With that, may I invite our next esteemed speaker, someone who I'm also very fond of, Ambassador Shyam Saran. Ambassador Saran, you've spent your time serving on several committees as ambassador to our country, to India in several countries. Now, what happens is that even in this whole discussion on Asian values or values of any kind, that a certain population of people hold, international negotiations or a country's presence at an international forum or a regional forum becomes a sort of zero-sum kind of interaction where you're looking to see what you will get out of it. Or it's about projecting your own national interests, identities in that forum. How do we circumvent that? How do we, move around that? And give us your views also on your sense of Asia through your work. Over to you, Ambassador.
Hey. Thank you, Neha, and thank you also for setting the stage for this very interesting discussion. And I'm very honored that I'm sharing the platform with my old friend Gowher, who has been really a kind of a mentor for many people here in the subcontinent. So thank you for bringing us together. Let me try and pick up some of the points that you mentioned. I will touch upon the specific question that you raised about, my experience as a negotiator. I think that is certainly something which is very relevant to what is happening today in Glasgow. So I think we will have a chance to perhaps, consider that. But I would like to focus attention on the aspect of Asianism that is the theme of your roundtable today. I have served mostly in Asia. In fact, I began my career with China. I've spent 2 terms serving in China. I spent time in Japan, in Indonesia, in Myanmar, in Nepal. So most of my career actually has been in Asia. And, if I'm looking at my experience, my encounters with Asia, what I see is that, number one, the way we are talking about Asia, I am afraid we are talking about, even if we are talking about South and Southeast Asia and East Asia, we are talking about a very, very complicated terrain. And I think we have to avoid the temptation to somehow label or bring a certain sense of uniformity, where in fact that uniformity perhaps does not really exist. But there are affinities that I will speak to. So my experience in serving in these countries is that the Asia that I have encountered, there are really two parallel overlapping universes in a sense. You have a Chinese universe, which is essentially East Asia. You have China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, perhaps, as one set of countries, and they do have a certain kind of a shared, value system in terms of, what today we are trying to talk about, revival of Confucianism. China itself has, despite being a communist country, has now, in a sense, revived Confucianism, and most of the cultural centers it is establishing abroad are very appropriately called Confucian centers, but that is a certain kind of prism through which these countries, these people look at the world. And if I'm looking at what may be defining value system as far as this universe is concerned, then that universe looks upon hierarchy is a very important value. Hierarchy, observance of hierarchy is actually equivalent to order. So if you are looking for order and stability, it is also equal to harmony. So you cannot have harmony if there is not an acceptance of hierarchy. So when we talk about, your concept paper talked about, isn't this something different? We have centralism, we have perhaps the state playing a much more important role. All that is to some extent related to this sense of hierarchy, which is deeply embedded in this universe. And yet you have another universe, which is essentially the Indian influenced universe. And their hierarchy is like Gowher said, we don't like hierarchy. We don't like, somebody trying to, exercise authority over us. We are very individualistic, and it's not necessarily that this therefore is a failing or a shortcoming. It is just a very different way in which in this part of the world we look at the world around us. And you have Southeast Asia, which is part of that overlap. You have some part of that universe, but you have another part of this universe, and that is why you see the huge amount of diversity across this space. And if we are looking at, how does India look at the world, or how does, I would say, how the subcontinent looks at the world? Precisely because of the plurality that Gowher talked about. Precisely because of the diversity that he spoke about. This diversity, if you compare it to, say, the homogeneity that you find, say, in Japan, or the homogeneity that you find in Korea, or the homogeneity that you find through most of China, it is very different. So we are not uniform. We are not, a sort of a single entity. We are a huge collection of entities. And therefore, the challenge for us has been, how do we handle this diversity? How do we make certain that this diversity, this plurality, is a factor of strength, a source of strength, rather than a source of weakness? It is important, this debate, because a lot of people in India today think that diversity is a weakness, that plurality is a weakness, that we need to have one India, one culture, one language. No, that is not what India will be. Even if you try, it is impossible to put a monochromatic frame over this plurality. So if we are looking at Asian values, we are looking at a whole spectrum, which may be maybe there may be a different way in which China has succeeded. I don't think if I'm looking at India, we can follow the Chinese way and succeed. Precisely because of that reality. Now, in terms of, are we different from the West? Should we define ourselves in opposition to the West? Well, certainly we have our own identity, and certainly we should draw upon that source of values. But I would also like to make the point that whether you like it or not, you are deeply, deeply impacted by the West. The great rupture which took place in our region was precisely when imperialism came to this part of the world. There was a huge rupture, not only a rupture in terms of our economic engagement, the networks which operated throughout this region, traders from Persia, from the Arab region, coming all the way to China, setting up settlements there, Southeast Asia itself being exposed to traders from India, traders from China. It was a very cosmopolitan world. And yet you had a sort of an impact of imperialism, which ruptured virtually all the things that we were familiar with. So modernity came to Asia with imperialism, whether you like it or not. So there are things from the West and from that experience which we have absorbed. And I think there is no going back to some kind of an ideal Asian universe that was, free of all the things that we consider negative in the Western world. No. Even our development, if you look at China today, China's development is through a strategy which has been honed in the West. Oh, so we can't get away from that. So I would caution against sort of a rejectionism. Because a lot of what we are today also draws upon this experience, even if it has been a very traumatic experience. So that's the second point that I would like to make. The third point I would like to make is that if I'm looking at, are there certain kind of affinities amongst the Asians? Are there really some kind of, values which, even if we are very different, still can be called as Asian values? And to me, these are what I call, maybe the 3 A's. And the 3 A's are, these are societies which are accommodative, which are adaptable, and which are absorptive. So they are cultures which are able to, in fact, assimilate influences that are coming from various places. They are willing to accommodate, not say, this is foreign, I reject it. So there is a sense of accommodation. So I think these kind of values are very, very relevant today. Why? Because we are living in a globalized world. Whether we like it or not, we are stepping on each other's toes all the time. And therefore, how do we deal with this new kind of a situation, a much more congested world, a much more crowded world, a world in which we are constantly, rubbing against each other? These values, I think, which are very, very Asian values, are perhaps quite relevant. So I would say, if you are looking for Asian values, perhaps those are some important values that we can think of. And lastly, to get back to what the first point that you made. And here I come to the most important value, which I think Asian countries, and certainly our countries in the subcontinent, and maybe also in Southeast Asia, in Japan, other places share, which is that even though we have adopted strategies of development from the West, but the Western approach to nature is aggressive, is aggression, is violence. So how do you develop? By, somehow taming nature. Nature is this wild thing and you tame nature. It is by somehow harnessing the forces of nature for human welfare and human development. So you put yourself as humanity apart from nature, which is not the reality. You are nature as well. So what is the difference? The difference is, if you look in India, what do we say? We look at nature as mother, as a source of nurture. Don't take away from your mother more than what she can regenerate. So this is ecological sustainability. And this, kind of a reverence for nature is across the board in Asia, although it has been overlaid by our adoption of, Western strategy of development. And in that context, I say what is happening today, for example, in Glasgow, we are still unable to get away from this sense of what nature is. You see glimmer of it. You see young people from across the world who are actually giving that message. But I think many of us do not realize that these are messages which are deeply embedded in our own cultures. And all that you need to do is to be able to give it full play. And therefore, in terms of negotiations, the negotiating stance of most diplomats, I think I mentioned to you earlier, that if I have taken part in negotiations on, say, the nuclear affairs, or on climate change, or on trade, my brief, as I said, is very simple. My brief as a national delegation is, you go and give as little as possible, extract as much as you can. And you are successful, you will be applauded as a diplomat if that is what you have achieved. You have managed to give very little and you have been able to get a lot in return. But if every delegation follows that same principle, then you will not get maximal solutions. You will get only minimum common denominator solutions. That is inherent in the dynamic of those negotiations. And therefore, what is required for dealing with things like climate change, or the climate emergency that we are facing, or the ecological crisis that we are facing, we have now reached a point where minimal solutions will simply not work. And therefore, you have to have maximal solutions. Each delegation must come to offer the most that it can, not the least that it can. And when you have that kind of a collaborative approach, not a competitive approach, to dealing with these kind of challenges, only then you will have results. And by the way, to end with, most of the challenges that we are facing today and will increasingly face tomorrow will be cross-domain, cross-national challenges. And if you do not have a collaborative approach, you will end up with what is happening today with the pandemic. Here is a classic global, challenge, which recognizes no national borders, which recognizes no regional borders. And the only way that you will be safe is if everybody is safe. Otherwise, you will not be able to defeat this. So if everybody has to be safe, then you need global collaborative solutions. And in terms of the value system, vague kind of value system that Asians have, a reverence for nature, which most Asians have, I think if you really put your heads together as Asians, perhaps you can show the way. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Saran. Again, some very key points. I think I'll just quickly respond to two because we're running short of time. I think you very rightly pointed out, maybe this value of working alongside nature. And as theorists on multiple modernities will tell you that one of the values of modernity was individualism. And that meant the individual very consciously and intentionally interacting with politics, the environment, the society, social structures around him and her. And that has led to a certain degree of control, a certain degree of hierarchy that you spoke about, including in ecological, environmental places, which is very different from perhaps a more community-driven, non-individualistic approach that we see perhaps in Asia. But I also take the point, and I think Asianism Retold definitely takes the point that we are not looking at a set of values that is only Asian. These are sensibilities. There are going to be various aspects of us that we have drawn from the West, like they have drawn from us as well. The second point I want to quickly say is that on diversity and the complexity of the Asian region, I think that keeps getting thrown back at us. And I think it also comes very much as a stumbling block to be able to come together and understand ourselves or work together. And essentially, perhaps for the reasons that Dr. Gowher, Rizvi, and you mentioned, that we have had very little interaction or not as much interaction between the Asians than we have had with, say, the US or the UK, and that has got to change for many reasons. So we'll come back to this whole topic on diversity and homogeneity, which is also a sort of toxic aspiration, the homogeneity aspect of it. But thank you so much for your opening comments. With that, could I now invite Professor Wong Lee, who has worked on the issue at hand, which is multiple modernities, the different routes that regions, countries, peoples will take to modernize. And Professor, could you give us your view, perhaps a little more concretely, on what has been already placed on the table, which is the role of the state, and also perhaps ethnic groupings, religious ethnic groupings, and how that comes to bear in the different kinds of modernities that play out. Over to you, Professor.
Okay, thank you for having me, and then it's a great my pleasure and honor to be here. I meet you all here, and then actually I thank John and Nina for inviting me to this wonderful conversation. So let me share with you my PPT slide for presentation. So nowadays a professor cannot present without PPT, so that's my problem as well. So let me share with it. So hopefully I can use my 10-minute time effectively. So are you with me with a slide? Okay, good.
Yes,
so,
we can.
Okay, thank you. So, okay. Sorry. So actually, I'm gonna have 3 discussion points. First, I'll just give you sort of an idea based in my academic works. This is kind of introduction of who I am in relation to Asian values. Actually, I have many hats as academic, but I just tell you a couple of things in my academic work directly related to Asian values. And the second, I think this is my central point for today. That is my takeaway on Asianism or Asian values. So, and I'm going to make the case that Asianism is kind of practice of multiple modernities, as Neha mentioned. So, and then the second part of my discussions. And then lastly, I'll point out some promises and limits of Asianism in world politics, as I see it. Actually, this promise discussion on promise and limit of Asianism in world politics based on my own work. Okay, so therefore I cannot claim that I can cover full range of Asianism. Okay, perhaps I'm gonna talk about most secular part of Asianism. Okay, because I'm a regular international political economy guy. Okay, so you have to understand me with that kind of my background, and then I'm a political scientist by my training. So there's 2 things hopefully you keep in mind. Okay, so idea of station in my academic work. So actually I have 2 lines of research on Asian values and political consequences, implications. The first one is the so-called what I call East Asian challenge to Washington consensus, neoliberalism. So actually here I talk about so-called politics of economic development between East Asia and the West. And as Neha mentioned, that I focus on the role of state in East Asia, spearheading economic development, which is sometimes antithesis to so-called market fundamentalism found in the US and the West. So I wrote a couple of articles and books on this topic. That's our first topic. So actually, the question I had with the topic is, what made it possible for East Asians, only East Asian countries, okay, like China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asian countries, challenge it, this Washington consensus. Actually, there are many complaints and discontents around the globe about neoliberalism, but these only Asian countries officially questioned validity of a so-called neoliberal model of economic development. Okay, so that's my some take. And then I emphasize role of Asian values shaping this challenge. Okay, so that's my first line of analysis. And second, this is a kind of a more recent work on so-called non-hegemonic financial governance. This is another interesting one. Actually, I've been currently finishing on book manuscript on this topic called East Asian Financial Regionalism. So here, actually, I talk about East Asian financial cooperations, ASEAN countries plus China, Japan, and Korea. So they started cooperating, developing regional financial safety net from 2000, and then they made an institution called so-called Chiang Mai Initiative. Okay, in Thailand, nice place to visit. Okay, and then actually they cooperate financially, and then made regional financial governance. Okay, but actually, a very interesting point about this is that they design their financial governance in so-called non-hegemonic form. In other words, here there's a couple of analytical conceptual distinctions here, but simply put, non-hegemonic cooperation refers to there's no state wielding veto power in decision making and dominating setting agendas. Okay, so therefore, actually, the prime example of hegemonic cooperation is the U.S. role in the International Monetary Fund. Okay, so U.S. has veto power. U.S. set the agendas predominantly in the IMF. Okay, so if U.S. rejects, nothing happens in the IMF. Okay, that's what I call hegemonic. But non-hegemonic here. So in other words, when it comes to financial institution building, this is the first time that we observe non-hegemonic form of cooperation. So and the East Asian countries made it. Okay, so that's why I'm been writing this book about this. Okay, so this is second part of my research. Okay, so here actually I analyze role of Asian financial crisis in shaping East Asian so-called collective identity for regional financial autonomy. Okay, so that's my central argument in the forthcoming book. So let me move on to this, my takeaway. So Asianism, as I mentioned earlier, as a multiple modernity project. So let me start by the key question I kind of been struggling with. Okay, with history of East Asia opening up to the European expansion in the 19th century. Okay, so we were exposed to the West. Okay, in the 19th century, and actually the key question, at least to East Asian countries, has been this. Okay, how could we, like Asians, okay, here, demonstrate the usefulness our local values and traditions for modern state building and material accumulation? Okay, this is central. So therefore, we don't look stupid. Okay, we can make material progress, and we build modern state by relying upon our own traditional values and so and so forth. Okay, so therefore, this is about, there's a tension here, okay? You need to build modern state in the image of the West, the modern state in the image of the West, but you still, rely upon your value. So there's a tension here. So, and then a response, okay? The answer Asian countries came up with, okay, is the idea of multiple modernity, okay? So basic, line of thinking behind multiple modernity is that modernization is not identical as to Westernization, okay? So there are multiple ways to modernize state and society, okay? Or multiple ways to develop economy, as previous speakers mentioned, okay? So this is quite, or in other words, we can maybe share Western universal values, like we can share Western Enlightenment values, okay? But there are many different ways to achieve, these universal values: freedom, equality, and liberty. Okay, so therefore, this is really, kind of innovation. Okay, I find in East Asia's response to the West or European expansion. So examples, I put down a couple of examples here. So actually, there's a slogan in the 19th century in Japan and China and Korea, that Asian spirit and Western technology. Okay, so again, you see the tension here, but still modernize with our own spirit. Okay, so East Asian spirit and Western technology. And then we have a rise of Pan-Asianism in 1920s and 30s. Okay, in China, Japan, and Korea. Korea was at the time colonized. Okay, and then also we have emergence of Asian value discourses in 1970s, okay, spearheaded by Dr. Ma Til and Lee Kwang-yu. And actually, this Asian value discourse was made against so-called Western cultural imperialism. Okay, so one size fits all modernization theory and discourse. Okay, we have a modernization theory, and everybody has to follow. And then there's steps for you to take. Okay, reaching out modernization. So this is a universal kind of progress, linear progress, okay? And then Asian values basically made against such a linear reading of a linear historical progress, okay? That's sort of, example. And lastly, okay, so how much time I have, I don't know, but promise and limit of Asianism in world politics. Again, this is my take, okay? Based on my own research, okay? So again, secular part of Asian values. So I took promises, okay? So number one is that Asianism with in the context of multiple modernity, can serve as a Carnatic discourse and practice, exemplifying alternative possibilities of organizing society and state for peace and prosperity. Okay, so that's we have, at least we have alternative. Okay, many alternatives. So we can have different. We can basically offer different possibilities, ontological possibilities here. And then second, let's suppose everybody accepts multiple modernity. So there's a multiple path to modernization and modernity. Then we can genuinely talk with each other, not talk past each other. So this is really good for what I call cross-cultural dialogue. Okay, because we assume there exists multiple ways to let's say achieve universal things. Okay, so we can talk together. Okay, so this is a very two promise. And last and the limit, and this is the last point I'm making here. So I find Asianism, though, a little bit too closely associated with materialism. Okay, say economic development. Actually, this is a kind of my interpretation in the context of East Asia here, China, Japan, and Korea. Okay, then actually, if that is the case, maybe Asianism, which is too closely aligned with materialism, may not be so different from, as a previous speaker mentioned, the Western, historical pathway. Okay, so therefore, I see some limits here. And then second, relatedly, let's suppose that we have Asianism is a source for, material well-being and development So let's suppose that what if that China or Japan or some East Asian countries stand at the top of the world economically. That means that we may create another hierarchy now centered on East Asia. Okay, so we as a underdog, we talk about equality and all these beautiful things, but we can be differently sort of identifying ourselves as now center of the universe. Okay, so this is I guess a danger we have when you have Asianism too deeply rooted in materialism. Okay, I stop here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Lee, firstly for keeping your time. I think you've helped us catch up a little bit, but it's been an incredibly interesting discussion so far. So no complaints on that. But I take 3 points of yours, which I thought were very useful. The first one being that when you spoke about Asian spirit and Western technology, I think you again bring to the table the fact that perhaps this idea of Asia or the sensibility around Asia is a little more clearer or at least discussed, or there's a greater awareness in East Asia as compared to South Asia. And there's a lot of catch up that we in South Asia need to do on that. The second is your comment on Asianism being aligned with materialism, and perhaps that would therefore not make us any different from the West. And in that regard, I wanted to go back to what Ambassador Saran said, that I think that we shouldn't be maybe in a rejectionist mode. There are aspects of the West. There is a world that we are living in, which is very cosmopolitan. There are goals that we have to live with. And one of them is perhaps materialism. But I think the manner in which we approach that, the extent to which we give that importance is still in our hands as we go along our own routes on modernity. We also had the example from Dr. Gowher, Rizvi, Bangladesh, where per capita income was not placed as important when they started off. It came out as a result of their work, and maybe that's something to learn from. The last bit, and maybe something that I'm having a problem with, is perhaps the framing in your presentation saying, the Asian values to build a modern, in terms of modern state building. Now, the point is, what is that modern? Can we define that for ourselves is really the question on the table. And as idealistic as it sounds, I think in our entire conversation on multiple modernities, I think it's also time for us to really understand what is that modern state building that we are aspiring for. But thank you so much.
Neha, you got muted accidentally, I think.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
With that, we have our 4th speaker for this evening, Dr. T.M. Krishna. I'm a personal fan, as I texted Mr. Krishna. I have your music on loop, which I hear every morning or try to hear every morning. But beyond that, I've also been a keen listener to some of Mr. Krishna's ideas. And I know that this is going to be a fascinating discussion with him. Mr. Krishna, I think the question that I have for you, are you on the call? Because he was having a problem with connectivity.
Yeah, my city just had a storm for the last 3 days. So our situation is kind of AC. So if I get knocked out, sincere apologies.
Okay, so it's not because of us.
No.
So the question that I have for you, Mr. Krishna, is that, from what we've heard from the past 3 speakers, there is an Asian sensibility, but there is, as you can sense, a certain tension to say, can we impose this idea of Asia on ourselves? And the reason why I ask you is for two texts that I want to pick that are really in conflict, in a sort of conflict with each other. The first is a book called Another Asia, written by a fellow artist. He's done inter-Asian theater, Mr. Rustam Barucha. And he says, look, as an Indian, I am grappling with the identity of being Indian, being Hindu or Muslim, being a man, belonging to a certain caste, belonging to a certain language, etc., etc. So this whole idea of Asia is too far away for me. It doesn't exist for me. So there's one view that is this. The second is what a professor from Columbia says, Professor Manakia. She's written a book called Persianate Cells. And she says, she asked this question, what is the idea of being Persian before nation states came? And she says that Persian as a language was spoken by most South Asians who were non-Muslims. And the idea of Persia and speaking the language was a sensibility, was an adab. And this sensibility came out only because of the different identities that were constantly in interaction with each other. So to put it simply, on one hand, you have one opinion saying, look, there are just too many identities that I have to deal with. So the Asian identity is too far away from me. There's another opinion saying that it is because of these different identities that play and juggle with me every day that a certain sensibility of being Persian has actually come to be. So give us your view on whether we can really impose this idea of Asia on ourselves.
Well, thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak to all of you. I'd like to first say that I needed to have the academic bandwidth of previous speakers, nor the regional understanding like Ambassador Shyam Saran has. So, but I will just try raising some things I'm uncomfortable about. You know, these words, East, West, these all I find deeply problematic in this discourse. Let me just say that out straight away. You know, these framings are such, have so much baggage. Whether you're an academic, whether you're an artist, whether you're a politician or a diplomat, you're carrying baggage. So, you know, if I was going to step one step back and say, what are we actually discussing? Professor Lee said something very interesting at the end, and I want to start with that. He said, he used the word universal things that we are seeking. I'm going to say use universal seekings, if I can just paraphrase him. So there is, in the human condition first, the universal human condition, okay? That I think is not east, west, north, south. It's a universal human condition. And then we are putting another point over here, saying there's a universal seeking. Now, this is an interesting idea. Is the universal seeking truly universal? Is the first interesting question to ask. In this conversation, our universal seeking seems to be justice, equality, liberty, fraternity, etc. Now we are presuming that this is our normal nature. I would argue no. I would argue the important thing about our universal seeking of today is that we are trying to actually subvert what we are in some ways. You know, we are these as humanity, we're a bunch of these very, very complicated, you want to use the word goodness at some level, and we also are, like Mr. Saran said, hierarchical, power, we want power, we would like to control. So here there is a fundamental tension in the human condition itself. So first we have to recognize that before we get into the next part of the conversation. And if you look at what we are actually discussing, maybe a little reductionist, but I also say we are discussing two ideas. One is power, another is identity, is all that we are discussing here. I could say, I could relate power in a very simplistic sense to the idea of the market, for example. And I would relate identity to the idea of culture. Of course, they are not independent. They are kind of talking to each other constantly. So here is an intellectual logjam. When you say that we are not responding to the West or whatever the idea of the West we're supposedly talking, but we are trying to define ourselves, there is a little trap over here we're not recognizing, because you are responding to the West. You are. You can say you're not. You want to define yourself without relation. The idea that you want to define yourself emerges from where? Why? Emerges from this philosophical conflict of something else. So if there is no something else, there is no necessity. So I'm just saying that we are in a way tying ourselves to this is like an incredibly intellectual trap that we want to get out of, but we are actually getting back into it, right? So it is in this conundrum that we are having this conversation. So when we say East and West, do they really exist in that sense, or do they exist only because of two words, power and identity? Because they only exist because of these two ideas, the idea of the market and the idea of cultural supremacy. It can be imperialism, it can be whatever, the manifestations of that happened in many different structures. Finally, you have the nation state also. But ultimately, it's the same thing. So we are trying to find freedom, at the same time trying to say this is what we are. So I think this is an important condition for us to grapple with seriously beyond this conversation, because otherwise our definition becomes a little murky. And so, also the idea, I'm just going to pick up on some words I heard today, and I hope you don't mind me doing that. Materialism. This whole idea that materialism is something that is very distant from the so-called East is also problematic. Our entire social hierarchy is a materialistic social hierarchy as much as it is socio-cultural. You other people, because you want to strip them of dignity, economy, politics, and life. That's materialism. That's as ugly as it can get. So materialism is not, it's not something we're importing from the West as a way of living. I don't think so. We worked with materialism not in a nation state function. We worked in local community level to a large extent. So I also think that, I don't want to position any of these words as being East-West or being Asian or non-Asian, because they are not. I think this is where the word culture becomes very essential for us to understand. That's one word we actually have no definition for. How does one define culture? It is something you feel, it's something you smell, it's something you taste, it is something you just know. But you just don't have a way of understanding it. So it is, I think, this idea of culture, and I think that I agree to a large extent that I find it difficult even within my two streets of my home to find a connection in culture. 2 seats behind, there is a form of music that to me is noise. How does one define that? How does one get across that? And why is it noise? It's noise because of my habituation and my social limitations, not because it is noise. So I'm just saying, I'm just trying to put all this out. So the other word that, 2 other words I will raise, and then I will try and see if there is possibly some connectivity also, is 2-3 things. I actually think as Asia, at least to a large extent, again, I'm speaking, we're actually not comfortable with democracy. I think we're uncomfortable with democracy. As much as we want to be comfortable, we're uncomfortable with it. So the difficult question then is there, yes, the Indian constitution is a very interesting idea of trying to find, again, I'm using a word which I wouldn't like to use, but I will, idea of Indianness is there is in the idea of the Indian constitution. Some would argue there is none, but keeping that aside. So why are we uncomfortable with democracy, right? There is always that tension, I think, that exists in this part of the world with democracy. So I think the point is then, what did democracy, or the feeling of democracy, not democracy from a constitution or a nation state, but the feeling of democracy, how was it there in local cultures? Was it even there? That's the other interesting thought for us to think about. And then you have a very closely tied idea with democracy is creativity and knowledge creation. We have to talk about how knowledge systems are created. How are cultures enabling knowledge systems? And here there is a contradiction. It's the knowledge system that oppresses, and it's the same knowledge system that creates. So which knowledge system is valued, which is not valued? This is all a very, very Indian idea. I can see it in India. I'm sure it's elsewhere too. Again, I apologize apologize for making it Indian, actually. So, but nevertheless, you know what I mean? So this, you know, when you use the word informal, right? If I'm going to pick that word, if you're going to call these informal systems, again, we are defining formality only in one way. We're thinking of formality in a certain manner. Is there a different understanding of formality and informality? And are we willing to say that the formality and informality are not something that is entirely the most beautiful thing in the world for which we have to define ourselves? Can we look again at our universal seeking of justice and liberty to re-look at these informalities and formalities? So to me, the conversation is in re-understanding all these dynamics of culture within what we all are seeking together, which is justice, liberty, fraternity, equality, etc. So actually, that's where the conversation is. The conversation is in that very universal seeking and trying to find our association with that seeking, because somewhere we acknowledge we are uncomfortable with that association. Somewhere we acknowledge we are uncomfortable with that association. That is why we have placed contradictions or presumed contradictions. Conservatism versus modernism. Are they really opposites? Or is it because we are having this tension and this inability to reconcile this? I'm not going to call justice modern or justice Western or justice from that part of the world, because there is enough that has happened in every part of the world. Before I conclude, the last thing is there really something Asian? You know, I'm a musician. I only receive the world from sound, and anything I say comes from that. So is there really a sonic, shall we say, Asianism? Is there a visual Asianism? Is movement? I don't know, but I just see there are two interesting qualities that I find, and I don't think it's purely Asian. It's as much maybe Middle Eastern, African, probably, and it also probably existed in other parts of the world before the two, an identity or market and power, overtook its mechanism. So it's actually not a West problem or an East problem. So the two things that I find interesting is, one is this idea of perfection that that we are forced to understand. That perfection is something that is brilliant. I think most of our art forms challenge that fundamentally. You look at our weaves, just look at our tunes. They may not be, within quote, perfect as a piano key or something, but there is this idea that there is a different notion of perfection that happens, and that perfection is not in it being in the presentation being ideal, but rather the experience of it being something that's deeply inside. So I think that's an interesting thought that I will place. The other is the notion of the in-between, which I think are also about the notion of perfection, imperfection, is a lot of what we say is not right, is somewhere in between. It's probably vague, it's abstract, it's probably not actually saying something literally. This is true of poetry quite across Africa, Central Asia, South Asia, and East Asia. You find this, and also, by the way, in earlier writings in Australia or any other part, you would find this, that this whole idea of life being an experiential in-between, and that manifesting itself in the way we conducted ourselves in social and political life. That's, I think, an interesting idea to explore. That's about it. I hope I didn't exceed my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. T.M. Krishna. I think I've listened to your lecture on the ugliness of beauty, I think about 3 or 4 times. Maybe that's perhaps one of the areas where you are bringing to bear in this conversation, in terms of when you say perfection and not wanting to focus on that as an ideal. I think very quickly, to take from some of your points, you're absolutely right. I think we've got to clean out all the clutter and really look at what is the kind of human condition, the human seeking that we want here for ourselves. Materialism is not East or West, just like justice is not modern. Yes, you're absolutely correct. There are several sections of us that are uncomfortable with democracy, I wanted to give my example of actually spending time in a small village called Bhim in the eastern part of the country, where there is a school called the School of Democracy, and listening to conversations there about the conflict that people are facing with those running the school on democracy and actually living it in their real lives. But the one area that I perhaps may want to push back on you is in terms of defining ourselves in relation in this whole East-West aspect. I think the reason why we are trying to come out of that, and what you're saying is that even in coming out, we are in it. I think one of the examples I would give is that today we are not just impacted by the West, we are also impacted by technology. Let's take the example of Facebook that sort of manipulates our anger, that manipulates our discomfort, and therefore creates around us a certain value system. Now, Facebook is not spending the kind of money or the resources to really see what that is doing in countries like ours, but it is doing, making sure that it is monitoring what it's doing in the US with 84% of its budget being spent there. So by virtue of this example, I'm trying to say is that we are today impacted by many other influences, not just the East, and therefore we've got to look at ourselves and define ourselves for who we are in this entire basket of influences, which therefore reduces the impact of the West on us and our identity. So that's very quick. It's not satisfactory to your comments, but unfortunately we're running out of time. We now have we now have Dr. Nicole from the Philippines, and she's going to tell us about a very interesting book that she has authored. It's called Asian Place, Filipino Nation. Over to you, Dr. Nicole, and sorry for keeping you waiting.
No problem, and I apologize in advance that I won't be able to stay for much of the discussion, given we're running over time. But I think actually, rather than really rehashing all the different scales and ideas of Asia that I studied in the book, which I don't think we have time to do now, I think what I want to emphasize is that Asia, in the period I studied for my first book, which was the turn of the 20th century and early 20th century, so late 19th to sort of midway through the 20th century, is fascinating because of its very formlessness, and the idea of Asia served as an index, and it continues to serve as an index of the prevailing geopolitical and international ideological power structures in the region. It's actually more of a blank canvas upon which people projected both fantasies and fears. And through my study, I did not find something innate necessarily. And I think that's something to keep in mind, because it's a useful frame to see why and how different scales and geographies of political affinity expand and contract at different points. So they're not disassociated from the larger histories in which they emerge, in which they're embedded, and out of which they're in a sort of dialectical relationship. And I want to, I guess, pick up some of the points that we just heard, and basically emphasize that. So Pan-Asianism is one of the concepts that I study, one of the intellectual histories that I went into. And Pan-Asianism emerges actually counter to Professor Yong Lee's timeline. If you look at it more expansively as an intellectual history and a discourse, rather than just an official ideology by a government, it actually emerges in the 1870s. And it emerges sort of in the, exactly within a dialectical relationship with the West, in that thinkers and political activists in East Asia primarily encountered the racial barriers that circumscribe the application of the West's supposedly universal and Enlightenment ideals. And so things that were supposed to be universal, things that were supposed to be about modernity writ large and the human condition writ large, they found actually were premised on an idea of a white Christian male. And so in coming up against these sort of exclusionary barriers to what were supposed to be universal ideals, they came up with an alternative understanding of modernity, of ways of being. And so that's, I think that in its very birth, Pan-Asianism exists in that dialectic, and there are many ways in which it exceeds it or moves beyond it, but it is always present. And I think about Pan-Asianism because of the question that you sent me and sent us all as panelists, which was, if I can quote, so far the Asian identity has been decided either by the West, called Orientalism, or by individual countries. Is there a need to look at a common idea of Asia so as to be able to move towards an idea of development or a sensibility that reflects who we are? So that was the question you sent to us. And I think that the history and discourse of Pan-Asianism and Asianism directly counters the premise of this question. There's a history beginning in the last quarter of the 19th century in which the idea of Asia and its definition was being actively negotiated and enlarged and clarified and contested. And this was done by Asians transnationally, not by the West or by individual countries alone. Within the Sinic heart of East Asia, a sense of Asia was deep-rooted and bound to the Sinocentric world. However, it progressively expanded outward through direct contact with and contestation by Indians, Siamese, Filipinos, Vietnamese, and many more. And we have lots of histories of different associations and societies that crop up in this period in which all of these people are members, Koreans as well. So, and together and transnationally through anti-colonial and political collaboration, a more politicized version of Asia emerged in this period that was developmentally oriented. This collapsed in the wake of World War II due to strident domestic nationalisms and the urgent needs of decolonization causing an inward turn in conjunction with the violent excesses of Japan, the former modern savior of Pan-Asia. However, this edifice of transnational collaborative Asia did not disappear. Almost immediately, it transitioned into the more ethnically limited Pan-Malayism and the politically idealistic Mafilindo, which was a union of Malaysia, the Philippines, and Indonesia, and the more expansive Third Worldism and more diplomatic and structural ASEAN that would follow. And have any of these visions aided development or foreign policy? I mean, that may be for experts in the room in both fields to determine rather than me, as I'm just a historian of intellectual history. But apparently not, if we are still asking this question when this history has been alive for over a century at a fully globalized scale. And I would also add that you mentioned Farag Khanna came to speak at this roundtable, and he's actually part of this very long tradition of Asianist thinking. So it is very much alive and well. I'm going to stop there because we're running short on time and I want to give time for everyone for discussion rather than me going on and on about my book, which I don't think is necessarily directly relevant to what we're talking about.
Great, thank you, Dr. Nicole. I think with that, we have about 10 minutes technically and officially for the end of this roundtable. But for those who are willing to stay, we can stay on maybe another 10 minutes longer. What I will do is now open it out to questions or comments or responses that panelists have towards each other, as well as from the audience. And maybe there's one question that I'll place on the table and to aid this discussion is from what Nicole said. That is that there was this Asian drafting of an Asian idea that was drafted by Asians, but it sort of fell into ethnic pockets, from what I understood very quickly, Dr. Nicole, from what you said. The question that I have and what I want to start with is that what is the role going to be of these different ethnic groups, ethno-religious groups, different groups, whether it is like Dr. T.M. Krishna saying, the differences in 2 lanes from him, in shaping these different modernities. So I'm going to just open the floor for comments, reactions from both the audience as well as co-panelists. You can just perhaps raise your hand or just unmute yourself if you're a speaker and go ahead.
One thing I'll just quickly say is that though at the same time you have more ethnic sort of groupings of solidarity and of sort of collaborative structures of thought and politicized sort of kind of action, you also have third worldism that emerges at the same time. So actually you also move beyond race in a way that is different from the earlier version of Pan-Asia. And I don't think that those are unconnected. So you have both scales working.
Right, absolutely. So anybody who'd like to make a comment or a response first? Anybody from the audience as well?
So actually, let me just, I don't know, quickly comment on your discussion on modernity. Actually, there's a central concept maybe you are interested in. Actually, in academia, maybe some of you know better than me, but actually there are many discussions and definitions of modernity. That's the issue. And then one of the famous one that you also mentioned, that Professor Einstein, actually he points out two premises, underlying premises on modernity. One is the assumption that we human beings are autonomous. Okay, so in other words, we stop living in God-ordained world. Okay, so that's the one major premise. We are human beings are autonomous, so we can design the future. We can design the institution. We are not following necessarily religious rule. Okay, so we are away from God. That's one premise. Second one is that the assumption that we have a human history. The future of human history as progressive. Okay, so the two things, underlying premises. Then if you mention the religion and other practices, ethnic practices, and if we combine religion and ethnicity with a conception of the modernity, then the question we have to ask is the religious practice or ethnic practices are basically in line with the premises of modernity, okay? Are they really kind of see human agents as autonomous, their religious practice within the religion, okay? Or do they see the human future, our history, as progressive? So that's a kind of a definition thing, but that's still, as a way to clear up some confusion maybe. So sometimes, normally the idea of modernity, normally sometimes I would say, in opposition to religion and religious practices. That's to kind of, there's a secular, so-called Western enlightenment idea. And then just quickly one comment to that Mr. Krishna about the West and East and everything. Actually, they are all ontologically empty, okay? There's no East and the West. The reason, but the problem is that as long as we define East and West, and that as long as we treat the East and West exist, then exist. Okay, that's a problem. Okay, ontologically they are empty. I understand, but as long as we talk about East in the context of the West, West in the context of the East, then we have a practice of East and the West. Okay, so. Still, there are a lot of things that we can do, and then as he mentioned, that universal seeking. So that's something. So you can do Asian value things in the context of universal seeking, and also you can have universal seeking in the in the context of Asian values. Okay, these two things, I guess, co-constitutive of each other, in other words, interpenetrating. So we can find common ground, so common practice. So I guess that's a challenge for us to address in the future. So also that's my take. I don't know whether or not that I have a good discussion on this, but that's what I'm thinking now. Thank you.
Can I respond?
Yeah, sure.
Can I respond? And I completely agree with you, Professor Lee. Yeah, ontologically, these are completely empty words. I mean, that's one of the things. But the interesting part is this. Okay, one is because you're positioning the East from an understanding of the West, or the West from the understanding of the East, they gain some kind of relative relevance and relative knowledge ideas, right? So, and I guess at some level, you're always going to be kind of both contesting and learning from these two models that are going to be looking at each other, even if they're not even one model, but nevertheless, for a matter of conversation, I'll call it that. But the other question then is, the universal seeking is, if you're all in agreement with that is a universal seeking, if we are in agreement, the question then emerges is, within our frame of the East, which is multiple frames, how does one go towards that universal seeking? And here you pointed at something, and which I just want to pick out on, which is religion. And I will add ritual to it also as part of it. So then there is another little knot over there, faith and religion, right? Which is also a complicated knot that we need to look at, right? So because there is faith and there is religion, and both interplay in every individual, okay? And there is a subservience to the power structure of religion, but there is also an independence to the feeling of faith. So there is this very, very internal community and individualistic battle that is happening within people, right? So is then faith something that is closer to probably our seeking, rather than a structure called religion? Now, if we agree that maybe yes, within faith there is that possibility of embrace that we are discussing, how does one de-entangle, or shall we say loosen at least, the hold that religious systems have on faith and belief? That's the other complexity I would just like to bring in.
Right. Would anybody like to respond to that?
Neha, can I say something? Yeah, I'm Yong. Yeah, let me turn on my camera. Yeah, very interesting discussion on Asian value. Here, I just come up with an idea about space and time. Why couldn't we see from the kind of space and time? Space means what? Actually, East and the West, or Asia. And when we say about the East, actually, it is not only limited to the Asia, but also maybe we have to include Africa and like Latin America, so many other places. So that means actually we say Asia and the West. And in some sense, we look at from the space. Then actually we have to admit one thing, maybe there are more inter-Asian among the Asian countries within the Asia. So Asia, it is sporadic. It is a continent, which and we can see like about the kind of the emergence of the modernity. It is because of the kind of the tension between the kind of Catholic and the Muslim, and which stop the spread of the exactly what we say about the origins of the modernity. And that means that's a really important thing for us to begin with the discussion of the Asia from the term of the space. And then we can see about like the kind of interaction, like particularly about the space, it has no spread evenly. So we can see that there are more interaction between the East Asian country, and there may more maybe than the interactions within the South Asian countries. But there are still some connections there, and this connection is stronger, or was stronger than their connections to the West. So this we can see this from the history of I mean we can define it from the space, the terms of the space. Another thing is like that the time is very important for us to understand about the relationship of the East and the West, or Asia and the West. The point is that actually this kind of process is not linear. Another thing is the people can diminish the kind of the distinction between the East, West, Asia, and the West, in the sense of there's just different stage of the human society development. So people will say this because some are developed countries, some are a developing country, or some are modernity, some are in the modern society, some are on the process to the modern society. So time is another factor we need to concern. We need to consider about the kind of the East and the West. And then that means what? And that means that even in the Asia, that means maybe, of course, the driving power of the modernity is the West. Mostly we said there is the, even the West, we don't say that it is the whole West. It is the West Europe and the North America. In many sense, it's there. But this kind of times means what? I think this kind of the spread of time, the spread of different stage of human society has no spread eventually as the space. So it's starting from the West Europe and then to the whole Europe and then to the long Europe. But the point is there, if this kind of it is only the receiver of that kind of modernity, a Western centralized modernity, then the Asian pay no contribution to the modernity. But if we find something like the East Asian join the kind of process of modernization, particularly if we see the case of the Japan, it becomes to abstract modernity as early as in the night, maybe before the 1990. I think it's 1879 or something else. That kind of reform. So we can see that kind of that kind of modernity. It is not linear. It is not limited to the West. It also happened in the East, and the East also play an important role. Take example for India or China. They are the Turkey place of the goods and for the Western market. So these kind of things we can combine together, and then we can come up with the kind of the Asia. Maybe this is no problem. The problem is that how we can see it's just some kind of the two groups of cases. One group is the West, and another group is the Asia, and then we can compare them, and they are also interactive with each other, are connected with each other. So there's no problem. We just need to explore, and maybe we can discover something in this kind of team. So I'm quite optimistic towards this kind of research. I think we can see that even in the 1930s, like Tagore's visit to China, and Tagore come up with this kind of Asia. And we also know about that, I think from Professor Lee's research about that kind of the Pan-Asianism, and he's studying from the 1930s, even he writes during the Lu's visit in China, the Lu and China's Pan-Asianism. So this is a long issue. People have to work on for such a long years before. I think we can continue. Yeah.
We have somebody from the audience, Ankita Kapoor, who wants to say something. Just before I give her the mic, I just wanted to respond very quickly that yes, there is a time element to our discussion on multiple modernities. And Mr. Krishna, I mean, I think there will always be an element of relativity. It may not necessarily, even if we move away, even if we don't move away from the East-West relativism, there will always be some element of relating ourselves to something. And this is happening not between just Asia and some other element that we're relating ourselves with or against, but within regions as well. For example, what is recently happening in France, where their idea of secularism is being termed radical secularism, so much so that it is at conflict with their minority groups, the Muslim groups in their country. And that radical secularism is being said to be at loggerheads with another form of secularism in the US. So these battles or these definitions will continuously happen. And I think that is essentially the process, because there will be one element where you decide to define yourselves for what is needed, what are the problems that you are trying to target, trying to solve for, and what is your route in that, and therefore what is your values orientation. But there will always be an element of relativity in terms of rubbing up against other kinds of whoever you are, whether even if we say any one of the Asian values, informal sectors, there will always be another kind of informal systems, and you will always rub up against that, and there will be a definition clash there. But
I want to respond to that. I think I want to clarify what I said. The question is not of relative relativism. It happens within streets and within two people. That's existential. That's the existential condition. But what I'm discussing here is, I think, slightly more primary. what we are trying to say, and I think it was hinted upon many times, is that, you know, even Tagore was brought up, and Tagore's famous argument with Gandhi is in fact very close to our discussion today. When between 1920 and 1922, there was this, when the non-cooperation movement was started, Tagore's big intellectual conversation with Gandhi was this idea of the other and this idea of the self. I think it is, as much as I think it is very important it's very important that we consider that this is going to be, I would rather go the direction that Mr. Lee spoke about, saying if you agree for universal ideas, is what is our different ways of seeking that universal idea. And there's always going to be something to that. But I'm saying the positionality of something definitely does matter in the way in the tenor and tone and our nature of our discourse. And therefore, an acceptance of that positionality in our discourse is very essential, is what I'm trying to say. So when I use East and West, it's the fact that we need to accept that there is this distancing and, for lack of another word, a competitiveness, which is coming from a certain larger political power, market-driven, historical background, and which I think has to be part of the conversation, and we can't run away from this conflict. That's all I'm saying. Thank you.
I mean, you're opening up some interesting points, unfortunately, at the end of this call, but I think very quickly to respond again, Prime Minister Lee said, yes, I think there's a universal idea, we must find our own roots to it. But, and he also said things like, the fact that democracy creates disorder in our kind of countries. So I don't think we are negating that. We are saying essentially that there are these universal ideas, and we perhaps have our different, our own roots to that. And that is the, whole essence of multiple modernities, that you will have your own root. Sorry, I've lost what I was trying to say, which is that it'll come back to me. It'll come back to me. Sorry, in that excitement, I've lost it. But let's get Ankita Kapoor, and then I'll come back to it.
Good evening. I'm Ankita Kapoor, an educator in a Swedish school here in India. Sorry for digressing and going a little back. But having lived in the US, UK, and in India, I really would like to applaud this initiation of Asianism Retold. It truly has been a very refreshing discussion, which was much needed. But I would like to go back to what Neha Bansal, the founder, said at the beginning, of this discussion on education. I completely agree with her, and as an educator, I believe myself that a structured curriculum encompassing students' interest is important, but education occurs a lot outside, through these informal systems. So it works through conversation, exploration, and experiences. So I think these informal systems really adds up to one's education.
Thank you for that vote of confidence. And I think we will take that as a cue to continue this discussion, no matter how, what we rub against and the uncomfortable parts that we open up. So we will take that as a cue to continue this. Just quickly, the point that I forgot with Mr. T. and Krishna was the competitiveness. I think that's essentially something that I'm hoping that we will be able to move out of. Again, it may be idealistic, but I think in a very materialistic race, while we may not completely negate the importance of materialism, to be able to come out of just blindly following that race is something that I'm hoping we can be able to achieve through this initiative. Like I said right at the beginning, one race was just following in the line of our nose, one solution, which was education, and we've competed ourselves with setting that up. Has that resulted in the results that we want, is a question that we should ask ourselves very clearly, very deeply. So that's what I wanted to say. But any last comments, responses, and then we will close.
Just one comment actually on materialism. Actually, that's actually I've been thinking of this. Okay, so maybe this is a future direction you might want to take with your project. Materialism, universal seeking. Actually, I also find that in human history, we compete. Okay, and we actually, but there are many ways of doing competition, and there are many ways of doing distribution. So actually, maybe Asian project or Asianism Retold, one issue for the future moving forward is how do we come up with new rules of competition and distribution? We human beings compete, okay, on many things. Okay, also we have resources to be distributed, as the outcome of competition. But there are many different ways of distribution. So I guess as long as we think we cannot avoid, okay, competition and distribution, maybe we can think of time. This is a time for us to think of new ways of competition and distribution. So maybe Asianism can contribute to this. I mean, this is, I think, perennial problem facing maybe this universal human condition. If I use previous speakers' word, okay. So universal human condition for every society, okay. So maybe that's one suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very pertinent point. With that, may I hand over to Dr. Jaspal for the thanks. But just on my behalf, on behalf of Asianism Retold, I want to, especially thank all our speakers, all those who've taken our time to actually sit with us through this long roundtable to really, discuss this topic, which doesn't have any periphery, and therefore can get quite complicated. Also, all those from the audience, and especially our last commenter for giving us that vote of confidence so that we can continue. Thank you so much. Over to you, Pramod.
Thank you, Neha. Dr. Gowher Rizvi, Ambassador Shyam Saran, Dr. Yong, Wook Lee, T.M. Krishnan, Dr. Nicole, and Neha, Professor Muni, we had seen him as well, and distinguished participants. It gives me immense pleasure to propose vote of thanks on behalf of Asianism Retold, Cali, and NICE. We are really honored to have such a distinguished panelist, eminent scholars at our third roundtable on Asianism Retold. I would also like to thank each of the speakers for their enlightening remarks. It was a great learning experience, and it is almost impossible to summarize the remark made by such an eminent panel. Hence, I'm not going to attempt that. I have a number of takeaways, and I'm sure our participants immensely benefit from the discussion. We hope to have you again in the future, like Neha said, maybe in real. I'd also like to thank all our participants for their questions. I'd also like to thank Neha, John, and Pragati, without whom the workshop would not have been possible. Thank you, everyone. Good night and stay safe.